combining history and literature with costumes and context. That's what historical interpreters do, and we're going to meet one next on City Corner. Steve Potter, and welcome to City Corner. Ann Williams is a certified historical interpreter, and you can see her at various venues around St. Louis through the year, and we welcome her to the program. Hi, Ann. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Historical interpreter. Some people might call you an actor. Some people might call you a storyteller. How do you describe what you do?
Well, it's not exactly storytelling. It's probably closer to acting. I think the main difference between what I do and what a storyteller does is a storyteller's focus is on the story itself, and they bring their personality interpretation to that, whereas what I do, the focus is more on the language, I would say.
Right, and are you always portraying a person from history like a real person?
That's more when I'm doing my historic interpretation. If I portray Lillian Hanlon for the Lemp Mansion or Virginia Minor at the old courthouse, whereas a lot of my programs are focused around literature. So I talk about the history of the author and the time period and give a context to the story, and then I recite the stories from memory.
Well, I want to set you up for something. How are you today?
Nervous. Very, very dreadfully nervous. I had been and am. But why will you think me mad? The disease had heightened my senses, not destroyed them, not dulled them. Above all, the sense of hearing was acute. I heard everything in heaven and on earth. I heard many things in hell, too. How then am I mad? But hark, listen to how calmly, how healthily I will tell you the whole story. It is impossible to say when the idea first entered my brain, but once conceived, it haunted me day and night. Object there was none. Passion there was none. I loved the old man. He'd never wronged me. He'd never given me insult. For his gold I had no desire. I think it was his eye. Yes, that was it. One of his eyes was like that of a vulture, pale blue with a thin film over it. And whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold. And so, by degrees, gradually, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man, and thereby rid myself of the eye forever. Now, this is the point. You fancy me mad. Madmen know nothing. You should have seen me. You should have seen how wisely I proceeded, with what caution, with what foresight, with what dissimulation I went about my work. I was never kinder to the old man than the week before I killed him, and every night at about midnight, I turned the latch of his door and opened it, oh, so gently. I opened it just sufficient to put my head in, and then I put in a dark lantern, closed tightly so that no light shone. And then I thrust in my head. It would have made you laugh to see how cunningly I thrust it in. I thrust it in slowly, very slowly, so as not to disturb the old man's sleep. It took an hour for me to get my whole head into the room. Would a madman have been so wise? And then when I'd gotten my head into the room, I undid the lantern cautiously, because the hinges creaked. I undid it so that a single ray of light fell upon the vulture eye. I did this every night at about midnight, and every night the eye was closed, and so you see I could not complete my work, for it was not the old man that vexed me, it was his evil eye. And in the morning when day broke, I boldly entered his chamber, courageously calling him by names in a hearty tone, and asking how he'd passed the night. And so you see, it would have been a ponderously wise old man to have suspected that every night at midnight I looked upon him as he slept.
Edgar Allan Poe?
Edgar Allan Poe, The Telltale Heart.
You do a lot of Poe, don't you?
A lot of Poe. I have a 2-hour program down at the Lemp Mansion every October.
2 hour?
Well, it started trying to just fill 90 minutes, well, actually an hour, then 90 minutes. But every year I memorize a new piece, and I love all the pieces so much I don't want to not do one. So I tell them it's going to be 90 minutes, and then it kind of just gets a little bit longer. And I tell the audience they can leave after 2 hours, but most of them stay.
Edgar Allan Poe, was that something you read as a child?
I remember that when I was about 8 years old or so, we learned 2 pieces, and now thinking back on it, I think they were kind of violent for children. The Black Cat and the Telltale Heart. And then my father took me to the library, and we got an old LP of Vincent Price. Assuming he was reading the stories, and I listened to that quite a bit. When I was about 19, I memorized The Raven, but other than that, I hadn't been exposed to Poe until a few years ago, when I just got very interested and started studying his life and his works.
Well, when did you start doing this?
2007.
Well, that's fairly recently then.
Yeah.
And never acted before, or this performed in any way? Or?
No, I used to memorize Shakespeare when I was in high school and college and just recite it to myself because I thought it was so beautiful, but I had never done anything publicly.
So were you always good at memorization then? Because to me, that would be the big challenge.
Yes, I've always been good at memorization. My mother used to say that if they'd put my homework to little rhymes or something like the commercials that I was memorizing, that I would learn my homework better. So.
Well, not ever performing until you became an adult, wasn't that a big deal for you? I mean, just, conquering that fear of, I've done a little acting myself, and I didn't do it till I was like in my early 30s, and that was a big deal for me to get over that initial fear of, getting up in front of people. The
first time I did it in 2007, it was for a Halloween performance out at the Boone home, and I remember I was extremely nervous practicing, but once it was dark and the people started arriving, and I kind of got in the mode. So
once you get into the character?
Yeah, once I get into character.
You're going to do another piece here. Tell me a little about it. Fall of the House of Usher.
The Fall of the House of Usher was written in 1839, whereas The Telltale Heart was written in 1843. There's a big contrast in Poe's style between the two pieces. You can't tell that till it gets further into The Fall of the House of Usher, but the opening is very similar to the style he used in his later works. Usher was actually the name of an actor that worked with his mother, who was an actress. She died when he was about 2 years old. That's where he got the name from. Mm-hmm. On the whole of a dull, dark, and soundless day in the autumn of the year, when the clouds hung oppressively low in the heavens, I was traveling alone on horseback through a singularly dreary tract of the country when I found myself as the shades of evening drew on, within view of the melancholy house of Usher. I know not how, but with the first glimpse of the building, a sense of insufferable gloom pervaded my spirit. I say insufferable because the feeling was unrelieved by any of that half-pleasant, because poetic sentiment with which the mind normally receives even the sternest images of the desolate and terrible. I looked upon the scene before me, upon the mere house, upon the simple landscape features of the domain, upon the bleak walls, upon the vacant eye-like windows, upon the few gray sedges, upon the few white trunks of decayed trees, with an utter depression of the soul which I can compare to no earthly sensation more properly than that of the after-dream of the reveler upon opium, the bitter lapse into everyday life, the hideous dropping off of the veil. There was an iciness, a sinking, a sickening of the heart, an irredeemable dreariness of thought which no goading of imagination could torture into aught of the sublime. What was it I paused to consider? What was it that so unnerved me in the contemplation of the house of Usher? It was a mystery all insoluble, nor could I grapple with the shadowy fancies which crowded upon me as I pondered. I reined my horse to the precipitous brink of a black and lurid tarn which lay in unruffled luster by the side of the dwelling, and gazed down with a shudder more thrilling than before at the remodeled and inverted images, the rank sedges, the ghastly tree stems, the vacant and eye-like windows. Nevertheless, it was in this mansion of gloom that I now proposed to myself a sojourn of some weeks. The proprietor, Roderick Usher, had been a boon companion in boyhood, although many years had elapsed since our last meeting. A letter, however, had reached me of late in a distant part of the country, a letter from him. In its wildly importunate nature admitted of no other than the personal reply. The writer spoke of acute bodily illness, of a mental disorder which oppressed him, and of his earnest desire to see me as his best, indeed his only personal friend, with a view of attempting by the cheerfulness of my society some alleviation of his malady. The manner in which this and much more was said left me no room for hesitation, and I forthwith obeyed what I still consider a very singular summons.
We're talking with historical interpreter Ann Williams, or maybe I should say you're talking to me. What kind of audience do you generally draw when you do this? Is there any pattern you see, any certain type of person that appreciates what you do?
People that are interested in literature, Victorian literature primarily. We get a full range of ages down at the Lent Mansion for the Poe program, anything from 14-year-olds on. We do prefer that they be at least 14 or 15 because younger children can't sit still for the program.
Mm-hmm. Make a lot of noise.
Yeah, and if anybody moves around because of me reciting from memory, the slightest thing that distracts me breaks my concentration.
You mentioned the Lemp Mansion. You perform at a lot of venues over the course of the year. Talk a little bit about where else you work.
Well, I'm a volunteer historic interpreter at the Daniel Boone Home. I've been out there since 1996. So I perform with them for special events for Halloween and the Christmas Candlelight Tour. And then I'll do Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol and scenes.
But before we go to break, you mentioned Charles Dickens. I know you love Charles Dickens. Why don't you do that?
Marley was dead to begin with. There was no mistake about it whatsoever. The registry of his burial had been signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge had signed it, and Scrooge's name was good as changed upon anything he chose to put his hand. Marley was as dead as a doornail. Mind you, not that there's anything particularly dead about a doornail. Scrooge knew it? Well, of course he did. How could it be otherwise? He and Marley had been partners for I don't know how many years. Scrooge was Marley's sole executor, his sole administrator, his sole assign, his sole residuary legatee, his sole friend, and his sole mourner. Scrooge had never painted out old Marley's name. There it was above the warehouse door years later. Scrooge and Marley. The firm was known as Scrooge and Marley. Sometimes people new to the business called Scrooge Scrooge, and sometimes Marley. He answered to both names. It made little difference to him. Oh, but he was a tight-fisted old hand at the grindstone, Scrooge. A squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. Hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out a generous fire. Secret and self-contained and as solitary as an oyster. The cold within him froze his features, nipped his point his nose, shriveled his cheeks, stiffened his gait, turned his eyes red, his thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. External heat and cold had little influence on him. No warmth could warm, nor wintry weather chill him. No wind that ever blew was as bitter as he. No one ever stopped him on the street to say with gladsome looks, "My dear Scrooge, how are you, and when will you come to see me again?" No beggar ever implored him to bestow a trifle. No children ever asked him what it was o'clock, and no man or woman ever once in his life inquired the way of such and such a place as Scrooge. And what did he care? That is the way he liked it, to edge his way along the crowded path of life, warning all human sympathy to keep its distance. Once upon a time, of all the good days of the year, on Christmas Eve, Scrooge sat busy in his counting house. It was cold, bleak, bitter weather, foggy withal, and he could hear the people in the court outside go wheezing up and down, beating their hands upon their breasts and stamping their feet on the pavement stones to stay warm. The city clocks had only just gone 3, but it was quite dark already. It had not been light all day, and the candles flaring in the neighboring offices looked like ruddy smears upon the palpable brown air. The door to Scrooge's counting house was open that he might keep his eye upon his clerk, who was busy in a dismal cell beyond a sort of tank, copying letters. Scrooge's fire was small, but the clerk's fire was so very much smaller in comparison it looked like one coal. Still, he could not replenish it because Scrooge kept the coal box in his own room, and sure as the clerk came with a shovel, the master predicted it would be necessary for them to part company. Wherefore he donned his long white comforter and tried to warm himself at the candle, the effort of which, being a person of very little imagination, failed.
A Christmas Carol. We're going to have more with Ann Williams after this break. Stay with us. I'm Steve Potter, and welcome back to City Corner. Ann Williams is a certified historical interpreter, and she's our guest today, and she's sharing some of her work with us. What does it mean to be a certified historical interpreter, and what does it take to be certified?
There's a curriculum that you have to go through and take an exam, write a paper, do a presentation, and then we have to keep, just like a real estate agent or something, we have to keep current with our certification by taking a certain number of credit hours over a 4-year period.
And how exact do you have to be? You know, like some of the things you did, Edgar Allan Poe. You know, I know you have it memorized. Does it have to be word for word?
Well, it's really not. I thought it was, but every year when I go back and review, I find that I've transposed a couple of words or substituted a word, so it's not completely accurate, but very close to the original text.
I guess nobody ever calls you on that, do they?
No, but they would have to be sitting there with the book while I'm reading to catch me.
That's good. Let's talk about some more of the things that you do at the Lemp Mansion. You're working on a piece on the Lemp trial?
Yes, last August and September, I spent reconstructing the Lemp trial. It was a 10-day trial that occurred from February 8th through February 16th of 1909, and in its time it was extremely scandalous, although by today's standards it probably wouldn't be. Divorce was very rare, about 4% at that time period,
right.
And it was unheard of really for a woman to divorce her husband. So Lillian Hanlon divorced William Lemp Jr., and it involved domestic abuse and other charges.
It wouldn't compare to reality TV today, would it?
Oh, it would be nothing compared to reality TV. So we did a abridged version of it at the old courthouse last October, and I'm looking to set up a longer version of it with either the old courthouse or the Lemp Mansion for
okay,
this
we'll look forward
coming
to
year.
that. Who is Virginia Minor?
Well, I'm not from Missouri, but I am surprised that a lot of people who are from Missouri have not heard of her. I heard of her first a few years ago when I performed at the Night Walk into the Past at Grant's home, which is part of the National Park Service. They asked me to write my own script, and they said, "You're Virginia Minor." And I looked her up, and there was very little information about her, so I had to get in touch with the Missouri Historical Society. She founded the Missouri Women's Suffrage Association in 1867. It was founded before Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton founded the National Women's Suffrage Association. She wrote a book with her husband, who was a lawyer educated at University of Virginia in Princeton. She was originally from Virginia and moved to Missouri in about 1843. But the pivotal thing about her that's important, I think, to Missouri is during the 1872 election where Grant was running for re-election, women across the country rallied to vote. And this was when Susan B. Anthony led a delegation of women to the Rochester, New York polls. And they actually voted. She was arrested 3 weeks later in her home on Thanksgiving Day and put in jail. That was Susan B. Anthony. Virginia tried to register in St. Louis to vote, and she was stopped by Reese Happersett. He was the registrar. And so her husband sued on her behalf because married women were not allowed to sue. Her case was heard in the 6th District Court in St. Louis in the old courthouse in early 1873. She lost. They appealed it to the Missouri Supreme Court. It was heard in May, and her husband was a clerk for the court. He was dismissed from his job. They lost there, and then he appealed it to the United States Supreme Court. It's one of the 2 cases of historical significance that started out in the Missouri Supreme Court here in the old courthouse, along with the Dred Scott case, and made it all the way to the United States Supreme Court.
And so you have an offering of Virginia Minor for us.
I do. She did not win her case with the United States Supreme Court. Their ruling can be heard in the following testimony. In 1890, she was called in front of the United States Senate Committee to testify why she thought a woman had the right to vote. Gentlemen of the committee, President Harrison has given Gentlemen of the committee, President Harrison has given you what should be a keynote to all legislation in saying, no question in this country can be at rest except for upon the firm basis of justice and the law. I earnestly invite the attention of Congress to the consideration of such measures under its well-defined constitutional power, so as to secure to all our people the free exercise of the right of suffrage and every other right under the Constitution of the United States. Representing as we do a part of the people of the United States who have been deprived of the right of their exercise, representing as we do a part of the people of the United States who have been denied the exercise of their right of suffrage, we appeal to you to act upon the recommendation of the President on their behalf. As citizens, as part of the people, we hold that our rights are entitled to precisely the same political protection as those of men under the Constitution. And your laws, wherever women's interests have been under consideration, have confirmed that statement and justified us in making our demands for the dignities as well as the duties of citizenship. Look back at all your legislation for women. In requiring her to swear allegiance to the Constitution as a citizen, you have given her the right to demand its protection as a citizen. In appointing her to federal offices and granting her naturalization, you have forged a chain every link of which binds her rights indissolubly to those of men on all points. When your laws declared that the Indian who renounced his tribal condition and entered land by that act became entitled as a citizen of the United States to vote, you have stopped yourselves from denying the woman who entered land, paid taxes on it, plowed, sowed, and harvested it with her own hands the same right. If a man's naturalization papers are open sesame at the ballot box to him, then logically and legally a woman's must be the same for her. So far as I know, there's never been a law or Supreme Court decision against woman as woman. In the case of Minor versus Happersett, 21 Wallace, which is supposed to have been such, the right of a woman to vote was not decided any more than that of a man. The court said, "The United States has no voters of its own creation. The Constitution of the United States does not confer the right of suffrage on anyone." But the court went on to say, "If the right of suffrage is a necessary privilege of a citizen of the United States, then the laws and Constitution of Missouri confining it to men are in violation of the Constitution of the United States as amended, and consequently void. Nothing more can be necessary to establish the fact that sex has never been made an element of citizenship. In this respect, men have never had any advantage over women. The same laws precisely apply to both."
Historical interpretation is really a really entertaining history lesson, isn't it? It's really what it kind of comes down to.
It is. I think it engages the people more than just reading dry facts in a book.
I think we've got time for you to do one more thing, and I want you to do it because you're really well known for every July 4th in Kirkwood. You do the Declaration of Independence, and people look forward to that.
Yes. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political band that has connected them with another, and assume among the powers of the earth a separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect for the opinion of mankind requires that they declare the causes that impel them to that separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. To secure these rights, governments are instituted by men, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed, and that when any such government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its power on such forms as to them seems most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience has shown that mankind is more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to abolish the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government, providing new guards for their future security. Such is the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity that constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of injuries and usurpations, having as its direct object the establishment of absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let the facts be submitted to a candid world. He has refused his assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary to the public good. He has called together legislative bodies in places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records, for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. He has dissolved houses of representatives repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions into the rights of the people. He has refused for some time following such dissolutions to cause others to be elected. He has made judges dependent upon his will alone for the tenure of their office and the amount and payment of their salary. He has erected a multitude of new offices, sending hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out our substance. He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, by giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation, for quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, for protecting them by mock trial from punishment for murder, for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, for imposing taxes on us without our consent, for depriving us in many cases of the benefit of trial by jury, for transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses. He has abdicated government here, declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. He has plundered our seas, ravished our coast, and burnt our towns and destroyed the lives of our people. He is at this moment transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny, already begun under circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages and totally unworthy the head of a civilized nation. He has constrained our fellow citizens, taken captive on high seas, to bear arms against their country, and to become the executioners of their friends and brethren, or to die themselves by their hands. At every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is marked by every act that defines a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, and General Congress assembled, appealing to the supreme judge of the world as to the rectitude of our intentions, do in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. They are absolved of all allegiance to the British Crown, and all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. As free and independent states, they have full right to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all acts and things which independent states may of right do. And in support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our liberty, and our sacred honor.
And if you've been to Kirkwood, Missouri on July 4th, you've heard Ann do that. And we thank you for bringing history to life today. And we'll look for you at the Lemp Mansion, the Daniel Boone Home, the old courthouse in Kirkwood on July 4th, and wherever else you might be in the new year.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for sharing with us today. I'm Steve Potter. That's it for City Corner. Thanks for being a part of it. We'll see you next time. Bye.